Jacob Gray was 22 years old in 2017 when he arrived in Port Townsend in Washington State on a visit to spend some time with his mother and grandmother, who didn't live too far apart from one another. Jacob was a very athletic man and was known to be an avid outdoorsman, possessing considerable skill and experience in wilderness environments, despite his relatively young age. He was also a surfer, and since he was originally from Santa Cruz in California, he spent a great deal of his time riding the waves there. In addition to this, and more relevant to the incident that would unfold, he also spent a great deal of his time camping and hiking in Yosemite National Park, among others. And his father Randy attested to his comfort in these kind of environments, alongside his skill set in general. At that time in 2017, Jacob was doing a lot of cycling trips around the country, and one of his destinations happened to be in Port Townsend, where he planned to stay for a month. It's important to highlight that Jacob was an intelligent young man, and he didn't have any health issues and was of sound mind according to everyone that knew him. To his father, he had also recently expressed an interest in pursuing a career as a firefighter or an emergency medical technician, which is a desire that would ultimately resonate with the extensive search efforts that were later undertaken on his behalf. On the 5th of April that year, he told his mother and grandmother that he was going to cycle through the Olympic National Park and camp out there for a couple of days. I've covered other disappearances from this national park, so I'll leave a link to them in the description below. But this is a very popular park that sees around 3 million visitors annually. It's generally considered to be safe, and the overwhelming majority of people come and go without incident. This was also nothing new to Jacob, as he knew this park quite well, and he was accustomed to spending time alone in wilderness areas, including this one. He had a lot of survival skills under his belt, so he didn't think that there would be an issue, but something would turn out to be different about this trip. That morning, Jacob attached a trailer to his bicycle and began to pack it with his belongings. He obviously took his camping gear, along with some supplies including some food, water, and some extra warm clothes. He also took a bow and arrow, though as far as I'm aware, you're not allowed to hunt in these national parks. It's not particularly clear why he took that, perhaps self-defense, though I'd imagine it's not the best option available for that. Perhaps he just wanted to get some practice in and thought that would be a good way to pass some time. He departed from his grandmother's residence that morning and set off down the road. The initial indication that something looked to have gone terribly wrong only came the day afterwards on the 6th. Jacob had travelled down Sol Duc Hot Springs Road and had seemingly made it to approximately here where his camping gear was discovered, abandoned by other visitors. I've seen this scene described as though it looked as if for one reason or another, someone may have abandoned their things in a rush. However, something came to light. While all of his gear, including his wallet, personal identification, and a list of phone numbers were left in the trailer, he did take a water filter and a camelback backpack from it. So it's not really clear that it was some kind of immediate rush to get out of there, since he found the time to rummage through the trailer to take them. As another side note, the bow was found on the ground at the site. Some arrows were sticking out the back of the trailer and 4 were sticking out of the ground, perhaps indicating that he'd been using it or planned to. The people who happened across this scene didn't have any context as to what was going on. They didn't know if it indicated that someone might have been in trouble or what, though they did find it odd enough that they called for the park rangers, who arrived on scene fairly quickly and agreed that the scene may have been a cause for concern. But they weren't completely sure, since there wasn't any information at all to go on. There was just nothing present to indicate anything. A small search party was put together, all of whom were park rangers, I believe, and they entered the forest close to the bike and fanned out, hoping to see who it might belong to. This search was described as hasty and didn't uncover anything, and their calls into the bush went unanswered, so Jacob was likely nowhere near them by that time. It's not really clear when he abandoned his things either, but it seems likely that he'd been in the forest overnight. The searchers also travelled along the river for a while and noted that it was very high, fast and cold. It's not clear to me if any further action was taken there and then, other than the periodic observation of the belongings. When they were still in the exact same spot, untouched and unclaimed for 2 days on the 7th, the phone numbers in the trailer had been retrieved and investigators were now making calls. This led to a conversation with Jacob's family. During this conversation, his family members raised the alarm and said that Jacob would never have just abandoned his gear like that so openly unless something was wrong, especially not for days. As a result of this conversation, Aside from learning that this was completely out of character, the rangers also realised that he would have had the water filter and a backpack on his person, since they were missing from the trailer and his family knew what he'd taken with him. This actually caused a lot of speculation, and you can see why. You have a very experienced outdoorsman that wasn't easily frightened and wouldn't have just left his belongings out like that, and for one reason or another had just seemingly abandoned all of his essential gear, including his tent and sleeping bag. Given what he did manage to take, it seems to suggest that he wanted to travel lightly, perhaps out of necessity, though that's not clear. Because of the scene, some started to wonder if Jacob might have faced some kind of threat on the road, or at least believed that he was in danger for some reason. There's no evidence to suggest that he was being followed, but if that was the case, he might have felt the need to quickly dart into the forest and hide. If he felt like he had to get away from someone, he could have moved deeper into the wilderness, became panicked, and then realised that he was lost, especially once he would have lost the light. Though it is important to highlight that Jacob was seen by others on the 5th on this very road, and law enforcement were told that it didn't appear that anything was wrong. He was just riding his bike normally with the trailer attached. Now, while the Olympic National Park is breathtaking, it's not a great place to get lost in, as it's overwhelmingly vast with a lot of rugged wilderness. It has dense forestry, challenging mountainous terrain, and powerful rivers within it, so if one were to lose their way in such a place, that would obviously be a terrible situation to find yourself in. Given the evidence at the scene, and the fact that no one had returned to it by the 7th, the National Park Service now began to put together the official search through the Law Enforcement Rangers branch. A lot of criticism has been levied at the Rangers for not conducting a more thorough search earlier, starting on the 6th. While certainly, with the power of hindsight, everything can always be handled better, but it seems to me that they just weren't sure that someone was actually missing. Though I suppose that they could have erred on the side of caution and made things happen sooner. It's a difficult spot to be in when you have no information at all, since for all they knew after all, the bike and the trailer could technically have been there for longer than just a day. It also seems that the national park at the time may have been somehow distracted as they were dealing with another incident in the forest involving an aircraft, which was later found, though the person piloting didn't make it, I believe. It wasn't until the 9th of April that Randy was notified of what had happened. That must have come as quite a surprise, since Jacob had already been missing for 3 or 4 days by now, so I can't imagine that went down too well. In any case, Randy's alarm bells immediately set off in his head, and he made his way to Washington, explaining to his employer that he was going to need some time off. He was inside the park and actively searching by the 11th, probably on very little sleep and with a tight knot in his stomach. Although there were professional search and rescue teams in the park looking for Jacob already, because of the other ongoing search, I get the sense that resources may have been somewhat limited and not as focused as they otherwise would have been. So Randy reached out to another search and rescue team, and they actually came out in force to help. This search group had search dog teams available, known as the West Coast Search Dogs of Washington. They requested the park's permission to use them, and while the dogs were eventually accepted, it took a popular Change.org petition to get them involved. I'm not sure if this was stubbornness or what, but the Park Service had a dog team in mind that they wanted to use, but that effort never materialised. And instead of just allowing the West Coast search dog teams to come in and do it, it took a petition to put pressure on them. What an odd thing to have happened. There's a good reason that we've been using search dogs in a search and rescue capacity for hundreds of years. Randy was obviously not very happy about this series of events, as it just appeared that not only were all of the stops not being put out, but the search was actively being hampered in some sense by not allowing the dogs in the first place. It wasn't just the dogs either. The National Park Service, at any time I'd imagine, could have acquired the assistance of helicopters too. However, again, for one reason or another, they just wouldn't allow the use of them, despite caving and allowing the dog teams. Jacob's older brother, Mika, was in the Coast Guard at that time, and the Park Service had been offered helicopters fitted with thermal imaging cameras to fly over the area, but they were denied by park officials. It was estimated that if Jacob had have fallen into the water because of the temperature, he wouldn't have lasted for longer than 20 minutes before succumbing to hypothermia. In addition to this, he was wearing thick, warm clothing at the time, which would have made it very difficult to get back out. Randy desperately wanted to know if that had been the fate of his son, and to some extent had to take matters into his own hands. Both he and Danny Campbell, Jacob's cousin, donned wetsuits and began to conduct a search beneath the water themselves, though their efforts did not lead them anywhere. Expert trackers from the Olympic Mountain Rescue Team were finally requested by park officials on the 12th, the day after Randy arrived. At some point during their search, they believed that they had found evidence of someone taking off their boots and putting on running shoes along the road. Then, whoever this person was had walked towards the river, could have slipped, and then tumbled down the side of the embankment and into the water. About 30 yards or so from that position, it appeared as though someone, or an animal perhaps, looked to have been desperately trying to get out and may have managed it. The trackers did say that they were not certain if it was a person that had fallen in, only that it was a possibility. There was a logjam not much further down the river from this point, and everyone believed that if it was in fact Jacob that had fallen in at that point, then his body would have most likely gotten caught up within the logs. Randy was one of the first people to get into the water to check that out, but he, among others, came to the conclusion that Jacob was not there. So if that was Jacob that had fallen in, then it means that there was a strong chance that he, or whoever it was really, had gotten out. On the 13th, the dog teams had finally been deployed, which were now late for seemingly no great reason that I can see. It didn't have to be that way, yet now a week after having gone missing, there they finally were. Interestingly, the dogs did provide a clue in relation to the exact logjam that I just mentioned. Two of the dogs seemed to pick up a scent at that very spot, but despite being thoroughly searched alongside all logjams for many miles, Jacob's body was not among them, so it's not really clear what they were indicating. Is it possible that Jacob had fallen in and had literally been right to that point at the logjam, but had gotten out somewhere nearby? You know, this is precisely why the FLIR helicopters might have been a good idea, especially earlier during the search. If there was a thermal imaging camera in the air, it might have picked up a heat signature somewhere that they weren't even expecting to find one. What a terrible and honestly cold decision that seems to have been, to not allow them to fly over. In any case, when the dogs were brought to the location that it appeared as though someone or something had gotten out of the water, they were not able to follow a scent. So that also may be an indicator that it wasn't actually Jacob, despite the fact that they seem to have been interested in the logjam, which feels like a bit of mixed messaging here. By the 14th, park officials were essentially saying that there were not enough clues present to allocate more resources into the search, as they had uncovered nothing. And in the words of one ranger, finding Jacob was beyond finding a needle in a haystack. In reality, he wasn't actually wrong about that, since other than the abandoned belongings and this potential clue in the river, there was really no indication of where they might even begin to search for Jacob. If they did allocate more resources, it likely would have been directed towards the river anyway, since the only indicator had been found there. But after all of the previous searches, this led to nothing. The search scaled down somewhat from there, based on that kind of reasoning, and at this point, Randy reached out to the Clallam County Search and Rescue Team. This search team came in with 100 personnel, including many volunteers, and they picked up where the Park Service left off. At this point, Randy had to travel back to Santa Cruz to properly shut up shop on his contracting business for a while, as this search was something that he needed to put all of his energy and time into, so that's what he did. Nobody really had any idea as to what might have happened to Jacob, and everyone was left guessing. Some believed that a third party might have been involved, meaning that Jacob vanished as a result of foul play. There was no real evidence to that end, of course, since the only thing that could be pointed to was the fact that he'd abandoned his belongings for some reason, and a potential dubious river link. There were no further clues up until sometime in May, when searchers from the Clallam team came across a pair of abandoned shorts, with the same brand that Jacob was known to wear. Jacob was not in shorts when he left his grandmother's house, but he had received a similar pair during the prior Christmas. These shorts were sent to a lab in Seattle for DNA testing, but as far as I can tell, I don't believe it provided any conclusive results either way. Even still, at this point, I believe that Randy thought that there was a chance that they might find Jacob, lost in the forest, surviving somehow. Randy pretty much moved out there close to the national park, where he stayed for quite some time. To the other searchers though, I think it was becoming clearer that this was unlikely to be the outcome. The only hope to some was that Jacob might have purposefully disappeared in order to start a new life somewhere, though there were no prior indications that he might have been feeling that way. When Jacob's parents divorced 4 years prior to his disappearance, they did say that it hit him hard and that he did have some troubles with that. Specifically, they said that he was never quite the same afterwards, and after having lost his childhood home too. I don't believe anyone truly thought that this scenario was the cause of the disappearance, but I can certainly see why it came up. Towards the end of July in 2017, nothing else had been found, and still more than 100 individuals comprised of multiple search organisations were gearing up for one more final extensive search. Unfortunately, despite being dubbed as one of the most thorough and coordinated searches that had ever taken place in Clallam County, no trace of Jacob was found whatsoever, and that was thought to be the end of the story. Now, something would happen 16 months after Jacob vanished. On the afternoon of the 10th of August 2018, while conducting routine fieldwork about 15 miles away from Jacob's abandoned bike, a group comprised of National Park Service staff and biologists, I believe, discovered outdoor gear and clothing that was consistent with what Jacob would have been wearing at the time he went missing. This, as it turned out, was in fact all of Jacob's clothing, and it was all discovered strewn over a ridgeline. This obviously triggered a search, and a specialised team were brought into a site around Haw Lake at an elevation of 5,300 feet. This team discovered what seemed to be a makeshift campsite with a fire, plenty of food and water, and other survival equipment. During this search effort, they also found remains, which were later confirmed as belonging to Jacob on the 15th of August 2018 after dental analysis. As for the campsite, it actually appeared as though Jacob had probably been there for a while, but it was never understood what he was doing there. He had quite literally just abandoned his bike and all of his personal belongings all the way up here. He could have continued with them much further down the road if he wanted to. Catherine Taylor of the King County Medical Examiner's Office, during her forensic investigation, concluded that it was most likely that Jacob had passed away as a result of natural causes. It is important to note that it was not possible to state this definitively, but she said that there was no indication of malicious intent or injuries present, but also that hypothermia couldn't be conclusively confirmed, just that exposure was suspected. The Clallam County Deputy Coroner also stated that the official cause was inconclusive. This was odd though, because he had a fire, and they actually found a lighter in his pocket too, so he had all of the means for survival. I could imagine a situation in which someone might have fallen and hurt themselves, making it impossible to get to safety. But given their own investigations, that didn't appear to be the case, as there were no clear signs of any injuries. Also of note is that he had told his family where he was going to be heading within the park, and this lake was well away from his supposed route, and actually in the total opposite direction of where he'd said that he'd be. Why did he abandon all of his gear, and what was going on with the bow and arrows? I can see why a lot of people seem to think that there may have been some kind of disturbance that caused him to flee. It's ultimately not clear if he was in the water at any point, though the dogs seem to indicate that it was a possibility. Based on my reading, there are three main hypotheses that I've seen talked about. The first assumes that it was the case that he'd fallen into the river, whether as a result of a third party or not, then got a real cold shock, managed to get out and fled the scene in a mix of panic and disorientation. Managed to get a fire going to warm up, and then after just became so unbelievably lost to the point that somehow he ended up so far away near this lake. As said, he was found higher in elevation, and while most people travel downwards, Randy said that Jacob most certainly would have gone to find higher ground, which is ultimately what he did. The second mention is that this could have been a purposeful act. The idea being, essentially, is that he may have wanted his bike to be found and so left it in an obvious place that would have been seen. Whether this was his intention or not though, I don't believe that his family thought this, nor was there any evidence that I'm aware of to suggest it. Usually when this is the case, there are some indications, but not in this instance. The final mention is that, as has come up, some believe that Jacob could have been targeted by another person or a group. To some, that seems to explain why he abandoned his bike and equipment in the way that he did, and it was all as a result of panic and fleeing from a pursuer. Jacob's family raised a great point too actually, about the park's reluctance to allow helicopters to fly over. Even if it wouldn't have found him, there is now always going to remain the possibility, even if faint, that a helicopter fitted with thermal imaging equipment may have spotted him in the first couple of days. It's the same story with the dogs too, I'd imagine. The sooner you get these dog handlers onto the scene, the higher the chance of success, and the fact that it took a petition to get that moving is just insane to me. I don't really get that. Am I crazy in thinking that you might expect a higher duty of care? I've covered many disappearances in national parks, and off the top of my head, I can't think of any where dog and helicopter use was just outright denied like this. Though I'm absolutely certain there will be other examples of that. There is clearly a piece of crucial missing information in this disappearance, and so I suppose this is a good place to stop and ask which of the three outcomes do you think is most likely? Or is there a fourth or fifth that I haven't even thought of? That brings us to the end of this. A big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you found this video interesting, please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe, guys. Peace.